The relationship between sounds and letters, and by extension, that between sounds and phonemes, can seem fundamental to us, at least to those of us who have learnt to read, and especially if we've done so with an alphabet or at least a segmental writing system. However, if you watch a child learn to read, you'll realise that there is nothing natural about the way we split speech up into discrete segments and assign each of those to letters. Kids actually find it really hard, despite their otherwise phenomenal language learning abilities. You can observe the same phenomenon with people whose writing system isn't segmental in nature, when they try to use alphabetic transcriptions. Before the advent of using pinyin as an input method for text messaging, Chinese adults used to really struggle with spelling out the syllables when they tried to write in pinyin. Alphabets cut up the stream of speech in arbitrary ways. Now, we always think of the contrast between b and p as being pretty clear-cut. They're both bilabial plosives. B is voiced, p isn't. But what do we actually mean by that? Opening and closing our lips, breathing in and out, and tightening and loosening our vocal cords so that they vibrate or not are all independent processes. We define b as a pulmonic egressive voiced bilabial plosive. So the air is coming out of our lungs, our vocal cords are vibrating, we close our lips, allowing pressure to build up, and then release it with a popping sound. B. And we can represent all of these processes in a chart. In this case, with time flowing from left to right. Yeah, I got that right. Which is another influence of the writing system I grew up with. So we have the airflow at the top, the vocal fold vibrations on the next one down, and then lip closure on the bottom. So for b, imagining it's between two vowels, we get the voicing carrying on throughout, whereas for p, the voicing stops for a time. So far, so good. Our traditional alphabet-influenced way of thinking about speech sounds is working. But, as I said a moment ago, the voicing and the lip movement are independent of each other. So what happens if we vary the voice line on our chart? What happens, for example, if we only start the voicing part-way through the plosive or end it early? If we say the English word dog after a period of silence, for example, we get dog with two semi-voiced or devoiced consonants. Contrast this with a similar French word, dogue, meaning mastiff, and we get two fully voiced consonants. Stop the voicing even earlier and you get the pre-aspirated voiceless consonants of Icelandic, hattur, hat. The pause between the release of a stop and the onset of voice is what we perceive as aspiration, giving us the distinction of English between big and pig. The bigger the gap, the more aspiration. Yeah, that's right. Aspiration isn't binary. It isn't either or. Instead, it's a matter of degree. Many languages don't have a voiced-voiceless distinction in stops, but instead differentiate between unaspirated and aspirated. The aspirated versions tend to be very aspirated, with a longer voice onset time than in English. Think of German, Mandarin, etc. Now, so far, I've been talking about the lips and the vocal folds with a bit of help from the lungs, but the rest of the vocal tract hasn't been sitting around with its hands in its pockets waiting for its cue to do something. In my dog example, in both English and French, my lips were rounded while I was closing off the airstream with my tongue on the alveolar ridge for the former and behind my top teeth for the latter. Meanwhile, the rest of my tongue wasn't just doing its own thing. The tongue is a very flexible organ. Our writing systems tend to focus on the main articulation, but the rest of the tongue is involved in what are known as secondary articulations. In dog, it was bunched up towards the back of my mouth to make the O sound, or the O sound, as soon as the plosive released. The spelling has D followed by O, but in fact the O is already well underway during the stop phase. Another example of secondary articulation everyone knows about is light and dark L in southeastern English. Light L has a secondary articulation whereby the rest of the tongue is flat, and dark L where the body of the tongue is bunched backwards and raised towards the hard palate or velum. Now again, this is not a case of either or, nor is it restricted to L. Language learners and teachers tend to be aware of it because dark L has its own symbol in the IPA, because it was designed originally by people who taught Southeastern English to French speakers for a living. That doesn't mean there's no distinction between S and S, T and T, N and N. In fact, if you play English backwards, you'll be quite surprised at how velarized the beginnings of the word sound and how palatized the ends are, so to speak. Of course, the beginnings are what used to be the ends before you played it backwards, if you know what I mean. Sometimes a particular feature can take over a whole section of speech. Retroflex R's in North American English can have wide-ranging effects, especially when they come between vowels. Many speakers no longer distinguish between Mary, Mary, and marry. Mary, 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 resulting in the rather odd, to my ears, Harry Potter. In the same way, Sirius and Sirius, the dog star and a satellite radio company, become homophones as Sirius. This R sometimes becomes so pervasive as to leave little room for anything else, as evidenced by words such as mirror and squirrel. I mentioned rounded lips earlier. Now, we mostly think of that of being a feature of vowels that spreads across neighbouring consonants. But sometimes it works the other way round. Sh, ch, and are all rounded in English, giving ship, chip, and rip. Here they're rounded even though the vowel is spread. If you watch a German speaker saying Tisch, you'll often notice that even the initial T gets some rounding. Sometimes certain features get to characterize a whole accent. These are known as articulatory settings, and you can think of them as the gear you put your speech organs into to enable you to switch accents. Look at this picture, and I would guess that many of you will be able to pick out the people who are speaking French. French demonstrates a particular kind of lip rounding, inner lip rounding. Now, that doesn't mean that French people have two sets of lips, inner lips and outer lips. No. Instead, this phenomenon involves the tensing of muscles into this characteristic shape, which you can see in the pictures. Now, this alone wouldn't constitute an articulatory setting if it were not for the fact that the rest position for French speech is an inner rounded central vowel, which also features as a hesitation sound. In fact, hesitation sounds often provide a good representation of the articulatory setting of a given accent. Compare the flat mid-central of RP with the more open fronter and of General American. And the close front nasalized of Mancunian. Nasalization is another feature that we tend to think of as either on or off. But in fact, the soft palate, or velum, which is lowered to enable the passage of air into the nasal passage, can be totally raised, totally lowered, and every other gradation in between. As well as being a feature which distinguishes words in some languages, including French, Portuguese, Polish, Navajo, Hindi, Urdu, Tamil, and several Chinese languages, degrees of nasalization can be part of the articulatory setting of an accent or even idiolect. If you cruise along the Manchester Ship Canal from Salford to Liverpool, you would start off with your velum lowered to give full nasal resonance to your speech. As you cross from Greater Manchester into Merseyside, there should be a sign advising you that your velum should remain closed unless absolutely necessary as you move into the unnasalized speech of Liverpool, which is often categorized as adenoidal. Another influence on articulatory setting is the tongue position and shape of the common consonants. Or is it? This is where it all gets a bit chicken and egg. Does the setting affect the consonants, or is it the other way around? I'm not actually sure it matters, as long as it helps us recognize and imitate the sounds of the accent we're learning. Let's look at some examples of how S-like sounds can reflect or affect articulatory settings. English mostly has a grooved S. Now to check, make an S sound, keep your tongue in position and then breathe in. You should feel a cold air only along a narrow groove down the centre of your tongue. Dutch, on the other hand, has S's with a flat, retracted tongue. This gives Dutch S's a hissy, more whistled sound than English, which gives a distinctive flavour to the accent. Castilian-Iberian Spanish distinguishes between ese and theta. To make this distinction clearer, the S is similar to the Dutch variety, giving me gusta comer patatas fritas con la cerveza. Some accents switch articulatory setting within the stream of speech under certain phonological conditions. In segmental phonology, Russian is usually analysed as having soft, i.e. palatalized, and hard, i.e. velarized ones. Somewhat confusingly, these are indicated using two sets of vowel letters, with one set indicating that the preceding consonant is soft, and the other set that it's hard. The Irish spelling system works in a similar way. I prefer to describe this as strings of speech being either front or back. The back strings are all round and voluminous, at adnavour, and the front strings are reminiscent of Quechua. Пятидесятишести. Она считалась одного до 56. So what use is all of this to us as language learners? As with most phonetics, it's very difficult to produce sounds based on descriptions. I can tell you a whole lot of stuff about French. For example, it has a rest position of a fronted schwa within a lip rounding. It favours a tense tongue with dental t, d, n, l. Voiced consonants have voice all the way through, Doug. The onset of voicing follows very closely after unvoiced consonants, papa. And the vowels are all at quite extreme positions and are monophthongs. So E, not E. U, not U. Now that knowledge might not help you very much, but I hope it will inform your observations about the accents you want to acquire, and it will help you better imitate them by getting your mouth into gear and adopting the position. Thank you very much indeed.